And we're back working on the old Logan again. If my grandfather had bought this machine new, it would have been during the later part of World War II. It might have been used in a machine shop to make parts for the war effort, or maybe on his farm to make parts for machines that weren't available due to the war. It would have been passed down along with the knowledge of how to run it from father to son until it ended up in my possession. Except none of that happened. I got this a few years ago from a guy over in Vermont that got it from somebody he worked with. It was really rough when I got it. It was pretty close to just being a parts machine. The backstory on it's totally lost, and it has no sentimental value. Without some sort of sentimental value or significance, sometimes it's hard to justify the effort that a machine like this takes to get up and running and keep running. But with that aside, I've actually really enjoyed the process of slowly chipping away at this thing's problems. So it's 2 thousandths under 3/4 of an inch and 3 thousandths through there. I think a little polishing will do it. I'm using 932 bearing bronze for this. The stuff came as a tube, but the inner bore is pretty rough and not necessarily concentric to the outside, so I'm using a boring bar to true it up. On the last lathe repair video I did, I talked about how I have all these random reground reamers. This one says 7485 on it, which sounds like it should be just about right. I'm beginning to wonder if whoever ground these didn't do it for this sort of repair. Ooh, we're undersized? Well, they got me, guys. Right under where it says 7485. Well, you probably can't see it because I can just barely see it, but it says, it's actually right above it, 742, and the micrometer agrees with that. This one's right at 750. I think I'm going to ream it with this, and then when I press it in, it'll tighten it up 1/1000th or two. Yeah, we'll see if that works. It'd be a lot easier to set this thing up in the mill with this side down since we've got 3 machined faces here. But I want to keep a little bit of this lip so that this is pushing against that rather than pushing against the bushing. I was setting this up in the vise with a little V-block that I made a while back, and it broke in half, and half of it, I think, disappeared into another dimension. I guess I shouldn't have made that out of cast iron. I'll whip another one up out of steel. There's an oil hole on these that tends to get missed when you're lubricating them, which is part of the reason these wear out. I'm kind of hanging up on that burr a little bit. I think I'm just going to run that in. That feels really nice. When I bought this lathe, these 3 gears and the one that's on the spindle were all broken. For these I bought just off-the-shelf gears, bored them out, pressed a bushing in, and cut the hubs off. For this one I found one that had a 5/8 bore with a keyway in it, which is what I needed, so I got that. Except that's a 3/16 keyway, and that's a 5/32 key, so it's always been just a little bit loose. So I think that was a good excuse to buy a 5/32 keyway broach. These are 2 more of those antiquated 5/16 nuts. They're a little bit smaller than 5/8, but they're bigger than 9/16 because they're 19/32. It's a thing they used to do. If you don't have a 19/32 wrench, 15 millimeters is actually pretty much just right. Oh, that sounds so much better. Alright, let's dig into these half nuts. In my last video on this lathe, I found out these half nuts are pretty much worn out. Probably more like a quarter nut. Right now I just need to get some measurements off these. 1.25 inches. I've got a piece of 3/4 by 8 Acme rod. It's not exactly the same as the lead screw on the lathe, but it should be close enough. Yeah, so that gap is 1/8 of an inch. So at 1/8 of an inch, I don't have any play in it. Alright, with that back on the apron, I'm going to go with 150. It's kind of hard to tell because there is some play up and down on that. There's really nothing that's going to hold that up. But I think 150 is a pretty decent number. Turn that down to just under 7/8. I'm going to throw a couple grooves in here. A friend of mine gave me this little boring bar that uses a 1/8 high-speed steel insert. I think it's going to be pretty ideal for this. I guess that goes in there and then clamps in the tool holder. It's close, not quite there yet. I know that this screw is slightly different than the lead screw. The crests on this one are a little narrower, so I want this to be a little bit loose. Yeah, I think I'll call that good. So, not surprising, this thing's a little bit too tight on here, especially with kind of beat up burrs on the lead screw. But I think once it clamps on from the sides, it'll wear in nicely. Might even give it a little extra life. Now I need to bore this out for that. So I've made up some 150 thou aluminum shims. One's going to go in the bottom, One's going to go there, and I can indicate off of that to get centered side to side, but I still have to figure out the center here. I know it's 3/8 of an inch from the bottom of this rod. Gauge blocks say 220 is a pretty good number. There's a little bit of play here, so I don't think it has to be super precise, but we'll be super precise anyway. Thought about making a little fixture for this. Might have been a good idea, but I think this will work. I'm going to plunge this with a 3/4 inch end mill. That'll get rid of most of the threads and the aluminum without worrying about a drill bit deflecting. Looks like a pretty even amount of thread still left in there, so that's good. I'm not too worried about that spacer moving. I might need another clamp on that. That should work. One of the problems with cast iron, especially when it's been on a machine tool, is it likes to absorb oil. I'm going to give these a good thorough cleaning, and then bake them in the toaster oven for a while. Clean them again. I did also rough up all of these parts with some 36 grit sandpaper, but I don't know where that footage went. I'm going to use this DevCon plastic steel, because it's probably as good as anything for this. And I had it. Well, that's set up, and I managed to not glue it onto the plate. Before I knock these apart, I want to try to chamfer for this hole and just clean up that last thread a little bit. That last thread is all kinds of mangled, and that might have made things worse. Alright, well that's good enough to run in the rest of the way on the machine. A little cleanup, deburring, and there we go. So the idea is that the lead screw is going to push this insert in against that little flange, give it a little extra strength. You know, some people might say that doing this sort of repair like this is completely crazy, but really it's just half nuts. I didn't time in my threading dial, so it's about a 30-second out, which turns out is the maximum that it can be out of sync. There are 16 teeth on this gear, so you're always going to be within a 32nd of a rotation on that. There are 3 ways to fix this. One is to actually time the half nuts when you glue that insert in. I'll leave a link to Build, Fix, Create's video on how to do that. The second is you can actually press this apart and reorient it. The third one is you can just add a little shim to it. Now we're pretty much right on that mark. Of course it wasn't on the mark before anyway, but now it is. Having that nut a little bit tight really isn't a problem at all. I think it's going to run in nicely and maybe even give it a little bit extra life. You know, I probably shouldn't say it out loud, but other than the wear on the bed, I don't think there's a whole lot else I feel like I need to fix on this lathe right now. And hopefully in another 80 years, one of my grandkids will have to rebuild those half nuts again.